So my talk today is going to be on One Health and reaching out to your community. Now, this is a topic I love because I work with a lot of communities up here, and this talk should hopefully give you the information and the tools to be able to talk to your communities and give them advice as to how they can look after their dogs and keep the dogs healthy, but also keep themselves healthy. And I'll go into that a little bit in terms of what the connection is there between the dogs and the people who look after them. So a little bit about me. I was in South Africa for a very long time. I was there for about 13 years, and then I finished my vet degree in 2015 and I moved back home to Kenya. So I run a little clinic called North Kenya Veterinary Services, and we're sort of up in the north of Kenya in a beautiful area. We've got lots of wildlife and lots of farms, and on top of that, I've also set up a branch of the KSPCA, so very similar to the South African SPCA, but we're a much smaller organization in Kenya. And we only, before I started up here, they only had 3 branches in the whole country. So that's, that is a lot to do with helping the community, giving them tools, giving them access to things that they need for their animals, as well as the really important thing, which is the education. I'm also involved in a lot of wildlife projects and helping just advise on conservation and taking care of the animals. And there's one really amazing project where we're reintroducing mountain bongo, which is a very, very endangered species. There's only 100 of them left in the world. So we are trying to get animals from zoos and the rest of the world and bring them back into wild areas in Kenya. So why should you care for your dogs in the community? Now, dogs are important anywhere in the world. You go to any community all over the world and you will find dogs have some role to play within the community, whether it's for livestock protection and security for homes, rodent control. Sort of rats and mice can do a lot of damage to your crops and your maize, and also just companionship. Dogs are amazing creatures, and they give us so much love, and they can really help people just by being there. So this all leads into the concept of what we call One Health. Now, One Health, you can make it very complicated, but to be simple, it's the idea that the health of people is very closely connected to the health of the animals around us and also to the health of the environment. As there's more people in the world, we are getting closer and closer in contact with animals as populations grow. And the more that happens, the more pressure there is, the more diseases come up. We all know what's happened in the last 2 years with COVID, which is, a disease that directly comes from animals and close contact and hygiene practices that have come from animals. And that, because of the way people travel now, has spread so quickly and done so much damage to our world. So that's the concept of One Health is really, really interesting. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how by keeping the animals in your community healthy, you can keep yourselves healthy as well. So that leads on to what we call zoonotic diseases. Now, simply put, a zoonotic disease is a disease that comes from animals and makes people sick. So there's many, many, many examples of this, but I'm going to just cover the basic ones that are really, really important and involve dogs and sometimes cats. So here we've got rabies, which I'm sure you all know about, bacterial infections, ringworm, and then worms, and a couple of other ones. So what is rabies? So rabies is actually a viral disease, and it's a very, very clever disease because when an animal is infected, it actually changes the behavior of the animal. So by changing the behavior, it makes it much more likely that that dog will then pass that disease on by biting or coming into contact with someone because of the way that they behave. So it's transmitted in the saliva from an affected animal. It's, you know, so if an animal bites or licks you and they have the disease, then you will get it. All mammals can be affected. It's not just dogs and cats and people. You know, cows can get rabies, sheep can get rabies, you know, everything can. And actually in South Africa, it's not just dogs. There is the yellow mongoose as well, is also another species which sort of keeps the rabies cycle going. The incubation periods, so the time from when, say, an animal is bitten to when it starts actually showing signs of rabies, is anything from 2 to 8 weeks. So this is quite a long period of time, and this is why you need to be very careful. And what's really interesting is if you're bitten by a dog, the closer the bite is to your brain, so if you're bitten around your head or your neck, the quicker the disease will come. So going a bit into what it looks like. So there's 2 different forms of rabies, of how dogs can actually show rabies. And the one that we call the furious form is the one that most people recognize. They generally behave more aggressively. They are all twitchy and they don't walk normally. They're sort of staggering all over the place. They can bite at random things. You'll see them sort of biting at a fence for no reason. They tend to salivate a lot. So you can see in the picture in the top right corner, you can see that dog's just got the saliva sort of hanging down from its mouth. And they can be paralyzed as well. It's like their back legs stop working. The other form, which I always find much more dangerous and a lot less people know about, is what we call the dumb form. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these pictures at the bottom here of this dog. So this is actually a dog that came onto a friend of mine's property. It was like she wasn't scared of anything. She seemed very, very friendly. She walked in and she wouldn't leave. They tried to sort of, you know, push her out of the compound and she just completely ignored them. Then they noticed that she sort of seemed to have blood on her back legs, which they thought she was on heat. But when they looked closer, they realized that she had some dog bites. So luckily, this friend of mine works a lot with community dogs, so she sort of recognized this as a problem. And so the dog was taken away, it was monitored, and it died. So they then sent the head for testing, and it came back as rabies positive. So this is really scary because this was not, you know, she wasn't aggressive, she wasn't trying to attack anyone, but she wouldn't leave them alone. She just came into the compound, she wanted to be around them, she wanted to be around their dogs, but she was actually positive for rabies. So it was all fine in the end. You know, all the staff on the compound were vaccinated, all the dogs got their booster jabs. That was just to be very, very careful. But this is something that's really important to talk to your communities about, especially because children are actually far more at risk than adults. About 40%, so almost half of rabies cases worldwide, are in children, because they tend to spend more time around the dogs, and also they're less likely to pick up when a dog is not behaving normally, when the behavior changes and it's not acting right. So they're the ones that tend to get bitten. And the really sad thing about rabies is that while it is completely preventable by vaccination, once you start showing clinical signs, once you start getting sick, there is no treatment, and it is 100% fatal. You will die. So that sounds terrifying, but I really want to stress the fact that by vaccinating all the dogs in your community, we can actually eliminate this disease worldwide. This is something that is possible. We can do it, and it's very, very easy to do as long as people follow through. And so this is something I really want to encourage you to do, is talk to your communities about getting their dogs vaccinated every year. This is just a little bit about the different types of contact that you can have with a dog. So again, that you can kind of explain to your community. So what we call category 1 is just if you've been touching or feeding the animal, and the animal can lick you as long as you don't have a scratch. So that's obviously less serious. Category 2 is if they are, if you sort of get nibbled or there's a superficial scratch that doesn't bleed. And category 3 is obviously the more important one, where you actually do get bitten or scratched and it goes through the skin and it's bleeding, or they lick you on somewhere where it's open and you don't have skin covering. So this next slide is basically what you can do to advise your community on what they should do immediately if they do have this kind of contact. So the first thing is to stop the bleeding. So you can either sort of raise the arm, and apply pressure, put a bandage on until the bleeding stops. The next step is really, really important. Okay, wash the wound really, really well with soap and water. I can't stress how important this is, and this could save someone's life. The next thing is to seek urgent medical attention. This is, again, really, really important. They need to go to a clinic. They need to have the wound cleaned properly. They need to have the rabies vaccination and also tetanus vaccination. And if the clinic feels it necessary, then they'll also start the rabies immunoglobulins, which is just another treatment. So my point is that just because you come in contact with an animal and you do get bitten, it doesn't mean that that's it. There's nothing else you can do. If you follow these 3 very simple steps, you will be okay. But it's really important that everyone understands that this is something that you must do. It will save your life. Moving on to something else, bacterial infections. So dogs can carry a lot of bacteria and parasites in their gut. Now, if people are infected by these specific diseases, they can develop a bad stomach, and diarrhea, and vomiting. And this is even more important in immune compromised individuals. So children who aren't strong yet, or people who are suffering from HIV/AIDS. If they have that problem, then they're obviously going to be much more affected. Whereas in a healthy person, it might not be too bad, but in someone who doesn't have a good immune system, this could be very, very dangerous. So this is generally transmitted to people through contact with dogs' feces. And obviously with an overpopulation of dogs in a community, if there's lots of them and they're scavenging, it's much more likely that people could come into contact with this sort of contamination. So it's very easy, again, to avoid these things just by, washing your hands with soap and not feeding uncooked meat and eggs to dogs. It's, if you can encourage the communities to sort of cook meat and eggs that they're giving to their animals, this will help minimize this risk a lot. Worms, one of my favorite topics. So there are a lot of worms in dogs, and I could spend an entire hour talking just about this. So I'm just going to keep it very, very simple. So there's 3 main different types of worms that can affect dogs and people. So there's a tapeworm, roundworm, and hookworm. And all of them will affect dogs and people very differently. The problem is that in many dogs, if they've got worms, they don't necessarily show signs. They could be absolutely fine and you don't actually realize that there is a problem. But if it's transmitted to people, again, it can cause sort of minor problems unless people have got a problem, like I mentioned before, with children and immune compromised people. One of the tapeworms, its life cycle involves livestock, especially sheep. So what happens is it's passed from the dogs to the sheep, and then from the sheep to the people. So in the sheep and livestock, they can either get very sick, they can act very oddly, like their brain's not working properly. They tend not to grow properly, and their meat, if they're taken to an abattoir, their meat will be thrown out, which is obviously a financial issue for communities who rely on these sort of things. And, you know, if people eat the meat which hasn't been cleaned properly, then they can get sick as well. There's another one which we have a lot of here. I'm not sure if you have it there, which is it's a hookworm, and actually it can travel through your skin. So what happens is, quite often with people walking around barefoot in areas where dogs have been defecating, the worm can enter the skin and travel, and you get this sort of white or sort of very itchy line through the skin. But again, you know, this is one of those things where it all sounds very scary, but it's very, very simple to deal with, and that's by worming the dogs, cleaning up areas where they tend to defecate a lot, and then again, not feeding uncooked meat or allowing them to scavenge. Now, one of the things that was mentioned yesterday that you'd ask questions about is the tongueworm. So it's really interesting because I remember it from when I was down in South Africa. We don't really have that here, but it's a really interesting community story that people believe that by removing this worm that lives under the dog's tongue, you're going to make the dog stronger, you're going to make them healthier. But if you all lift up your tongue and feel underneath it here, you'll feel that there is a line of tissue, and that is what we call the frenulum. And so that's what it is in dogs. So it's not actually a worm. And I was one of those people who, when I was born, mine was much longer than it should have been. So I had to have mine cut. And I can tell you one thing, it was very, very, very painful. And so it's not actually a worm. And I have to say that again and again, because I know a lot of people believe that. It really, you know, it's not. But if you want to protect the dogs, especially the puppies, then deworming them is the best thing that you can do. So I'd really like you, if there's one thing you take away from this, is to encourage the community, is that this is not actually going to help the dogs, and sometimes it's actually going to do a lot more harm. We have, you know, there's different stories everywhere. I mean, here we have a situation where people believe that by cutting the puppy's teeth, so they actually use a clipper and they cut the teeth in half, and they believe that that will stop the puppies getting sick. And again, that's so painful, and it really is quite horrible for the dogs. So I think, you know, as role models in your community, as people who work with dogs, this is something that you can really help with and educate people as to what they can do better. Okay, ringworm. So ringworm, it's not actually a worm, it's a fungus. And this sort of lives on the skin of more cats than dogs. But again, you know, in people who are already sick, they can get infected with this by, you know, if they're handling puppies and kittens that have got it. And it causes this sort of red, circular, very itchy rash. You can see the picture here. And so just basically making sure good hygiene, making sure that, you know, you're careful when you're handling especially sick puppies and kittens. And also by making sure that the puppies and kittens are healthy, then it's much less likely that they will develop these sort of conditions. So ticks and fleas. Now, this again is a very interesting topic, because technically with ticks, it's not that, you know, they necessarily give people the same diseases that dogs will get, but the ticks that give dogs tick fever will also carry a different disease which can cause tick fever in people. Now, tick fever in dogs, I'm sure some of you must have seen it. You know, the dogs get very, very pale, they stop eating, they're really unhappy. This picture sort of at the top here of the teeth of the dog shows that yellow. It's not a nice healthy pink, and it can be very dangerous to the dogs. And also, you know, tick fever in humans is not very nice either. Fleas, you know, obviously ticks and fleas are very irritating to both dogs and people, so you don't really want them in the house. And so by controlling them, you can keep everyone's lives a lot more comfortable. Fleas can actually carry diseases that affect people. And I have seen a couple of cases of dogs that have had lots and lots and lots of fleas, and they're very sick just because the fleas are taking so much blood from the dogs that they're very weak. And you can see this picture at the bottom here that, you know, this was a rescue dog that came into our clinic and it was absolutely covered, and the water underneath it you can see is a little bit red, and that's just from the flea dirt when we wash the dog, and you can see that redness comes from the fact that the fleas are absorbing so much blood from the dog. Tick bite necrosis, I don't know, this is sort of more common in certain areas and less common in others. I work more with horses actually, so this is a horse with a tick bite abscess, and just by biting, the saliva of the tick contains something very, very nasty, that then causes these big wounds which can be quite tricky to heal. And again, it's very simple to control just by advising weekly dipping. And I'll go into all of these things in a little bit more detail in a bit. So threat to wildlife. So this is something I find very interesting, and I'm sure, you know, in your jobs as rangers, you know, the wildlife is something that's very, very important to you too. So dogs in communities, you know, they can be a threat to wildlife just by hunting and predation, and also competition for resources. For me, the most important thing is disease, and that's what we work on very, very hard up here, is trying to prevent disease in the community dogs so that they don't spread it to the wild animals. So we had an issue about 2 years ago where we've got a small population of wild dog that live up here, and they all started dying. So when we looked into it, we realized that some of the community dogs in areas as well were also dying. And it turned out that it was distemper, which is a disease, you know, that dogs get that can make them, they either sort of start vomiting, or they've got diarrhea, or they can become very neurological, their brains don't work properly. But the problem is that some of these diseases, like rabies, like parvo, like distemper, can spill over and affect wildlife. And we lost about 70% of our wild dog population in just under 4 months. And that, you know, that's something that, again, is by vaccinating dogs, and all of these diseases can be vaccinated against, and you can protect your wildlife by just vaccinating them. So moving on to sort of the second part of this topic. I'm very, very aware, because of the work I do here, that caring for dogs in communities depends totally on what resources they have access to. You can't expect someone who struggles to put food on their own table and feed their kids to take wonderful care of their dogs and put lots and lots of money into looking after their dogs, because they just don't have that ability. So we try really hard to provide other options and sort of tools that people can use so that they can look after their dogs, but for very little money. So water is the first thing. You know, dogs need to have access to water all the time. Now, I've said there, fresh, clean water, this is not always possible. And I know that, you know, sometimes the only water you have available is from the nearest river, and it might not be super clean, but at least the dogs then have access to water. Food, I'll go into a little bit in terms of how you can advise people on diet. Shelter is really important, you know, somewhere where, you know, the dogs can get away from the rain and keep dry. And then primary animal health care is, you know, sort of the very, very basics of what dogs need in a community. So I'll go into that in a little bit as well. So diet. So this is a very interesting topic, and I do understand that this changes depending on what area that you're in. So I've tried to keep it very simple, so that you sort of understand what a dog needs. And so you can then, if anyone asks you, you can kind of explain to them how they can help their dog based on what they have available to them. So carbohydrates is probably going to be the top of their diet, just because it's the cheapest. It's going to be the thing that is going to cost the least amount of money. So examples of this would be rice or pup, which we call ugali here, sweet potatoes, or just normal potatoes as long as they're cooked. Now, all of this, the dogs can use some of it for energy, but a lot of it is just filling their stomachs and making them feel full. But it's really important that this isn't their whole diet. I always say it should be about half of the diet, no more than that. So just feeding pup or just feeding rice is not enough for the dog. They need a little bit more than that. The other thing that I want to go into is something called aflatoxin. And we've had a big problem here. We've had a lot of rain, and so we've had a big problem with the maize that's used for the flour and everything getting very, very wet. Now, when it gets wet, it develops a sort of a growth of a fungus which produces these toxins or poisons that then make the dogs very sick. And dogs are actually much more susceptible to it than people. So just because the food is safe for a person to eat doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe for the dog. And so it's really important that, you know, this food is kept dry and it's kept somewhere where it's not getting wet and damp. And that will really reduce the risk of this for dogs. Going on to protein. Obviously, this is a really important part of the diet and something that's really important for the dogs. So you can use meat, you can use offal, you can use fish. You can see in the sort of bottom of the picture there, we get this these dried fish here called a mena, which is very high in protein. They're very, very small. They're only sort of, you know, that big. But they're a very good and very cheap source of protein that people can feed their dogs. Milk as well, as long as it's not given, you know, too much. Eggs, you know, eggs are great. But going back to what I was talking about previously with the bacteria, it's really, really important that if you're going to feed meat, if you're going to feed offal, if you're going to feed eggs, that it's cooked, because this will stop the dogs getting sick. Fat, this should only be a very small amount of the diet. Okay, so animal fat, you know, fat from the carcass or vegetable oil, you can include a little bit of that. It will, you know, give the dog, it's very, very high in energy, but really shouldn't be fed in a large amount. This is just a little bit every now and again. Vegetables are amazing for dogs, and I feed my dogs a lot of vegetables. So, you know, anything we have left over in the house, like carrots, green beans, spinach, kale, anything like that, you know, that can be added to the dog's diet, and it contains a lot of really good things for the dogs. And that, you know, that can, especially in local communities, you know, that's something that they usually are growing in their own gardens, and it's easier for them to have that to give their dogs. Everyone always asks me about bones. Bones, they're great for dogs. They can help look after their teeth, but it's really important that you don't feed cooked bones. So what happens when bones are cooked is that when the dogs eat them, they tend to splinter. So they break up into tiny little pieces, and these can be very, very sharp pieces. And they can really injure the dog's stomachs and get stuck. And it's very unpleasant for the dog. So if people want to feed bones, I've always say, you know, that's great, but try and only give them the really big bones that haven't been cooked, like a leg bone or something like that they can chew on, but they're not necessarily going to sort of, you know, like a rib bone or something that's been in the fire, that will just splinter into tiny little pieces and can really hurt the dog. Sometimes they'll be fine, sometimes not. It's just one of those things where generally it's better to try and avoid it. I know you've probably heard about dry food, and I'm sure your APU dogs are probably on dry food. So these pellets, they're great, they're amazing, but they're very, very expensive, and you know, it's not feasible to expect communities to be able to go out and buy these pellets. But if possible, and especially if dogs are ill, if you can get welfare organizations to donate a little bit, then it is great, but because they contain everything a dog needs. But yeah, so there are options, and I hope, yeah, if there's any questions about, you know, So just going into some things that you really should avoid feeding dogs. Onions are not good for dogs. Got to try and avoid feeding those. It will make them very, very sick. Nuts as well. They're too high in fat, and cooked bones we've obviously already covered. And then potatoes can be very, very dangerous if they're not cooked or if they're green. Chocolate and alcohol, very dangerous for dogs. So yeah. Okay, so now I'm just going to finish off sort of going through the primary animal healthcare bit. So we'll talk about vaccinations first. So I know I keep going on and on about the vaccinations, but there's two different vaccinations that generally they will get, which is rabies, and then the other one is parvo, distemper, lepto, and that's what we call the 5-in-1. And generally we always start in the puppies. They start at 6 weeks, then again at 9 weeks, and then again at 12 weeks. And the rabies we give at 12 weeks. I always advise here that we do the vaccinations every year. You know, some places like rabies, they'll only do every 2 to 3 years. But considering that we're in a very high risk area and there's a lot of rabies around, the more often we can vaccinate, the better. Now, obviously, having access to these vaccinations is difficult for communities. You know, it's not like they can take their dog to the closest vet and get all of this done. And it's usually quite expensive as well. But what we try and do, and I know there's some welfare organizations in Hoedspruit like Halo, is try and partner with them, try and organize a sort of partnership where they can come into your communities and they can do these campaigns and they can help with vaccination, they can help with worming. And that's something that you can really sort of start off and do and set this up in partnership with them to help your communities by bringing these people in who want to help, and they can then bring these things in that you know the animals really, really need. Worming, obviously, you know, this is something that is very, very easy to do. The worming doesn't actually cost that much, the tablets, but it's really important to get the right ones and make sure that they are specifically for dogs. In puppies, we do quite a lot because puppies are very, very heavily infected most of the time. So we'll start at sort of 2 weeks, and then we'll do it again at 4 weeks, and then again at 6 weeks. And then after that, we can do sort of every 3 to 6 months. And that really will keep your community healthier and safe, and also the dogs. And going back to that sort of tongueworm, a lot of the reasons why the puppies probably don't do so well when they're younger is because of the worms that they're carrying. And so just by treating them with these little tablets, you can make a huge difference to the people. Going back to the ticks and fleas, there's lots of different options that you can use. I won't really go into much on the spot on and the tablets at the bottom there. You can see the pictures because they are quite expensive and they're quite difficult to get hold of. You know, maybe if one of the welfare organizations comes through, they might have some. But what is easier for communities and what we do is we do sort of dipping days once a week. We use something like the Stelladone bottle that you've got there, which can be used for livestock as well. It's really important to choose the right one though, because not all of them are safe for dogs. But something like, trying to think what's available in South Africa and compared to here, but Ectodex or Tactic, read the instructions carefully so that you get the mixtures properly. And then just be careful dipping puppies and pregnant dogs. For everything else, you know, just by dipping them once a week, you're going to make a huge difference to that dog. You'll reduce the risk of them getting tick fever, and you'll reduce the amount of ticks and fleas that those dogs are going to be bringing back to their people. Going into sort of grooming, there are two main things I want to talk about here, which is matting and mange. So you can see this picture of the dog on the top here. You can see how red and angry and very, very sore that is. And that was purely because her hair had become so clumped together and it was pulling on the skin, and it was creating a really horrible situation underneath that was very, very painful for her. So if you're sort of talking to people in the community and you can see that their dogs have got long hair and the hair is starting to stick together, it's very easy just to sort of cut that off and prevent it, because this is what happens underneath if it's not looked after. The second one is mange. I'm sure you'll probably see some of these dogs wandering around the community where they kind of lose all their hair. They almost look like old grannies because they're all wrinkled, and the skin becomes quite thick, and the dogs are quite unhappy. And again, you know, this is very easily treated either with a sort of injection every week or just dipping them with the correct stuff. But, you know, hopefully if you do manage to partner with one of the welfare organizations, then they can help with that. I'm just going to go briefly into dealing with wounds, because this is one of my favorite topics in the world. This is actually a horse, but I just wanted to show you how much you can actually do with wounds with very, very little. So this horse cut itself on a rock, and the wound was really, really horrible. And you can see the next picture is the same horse about 8 weeks later. The only thing we did was keep the wound covered and wash it with salt water. That's it. There was no other treatment given. The horse wasn't on antibiotics. There was no fancy treatments, but something as simple as that, just by keeping it clean, just with a little bit of warm water and some salt and keeping it covered, the wound healed amazingly well. Now, one of my favorite topics, sterilization. Dogs can produce so many puppies a year, and the more puppies there are, the more dogs there are, the bigger the risk of disease. There's more unwanted puppies which won't be looked after. They're probably starving, they're suffering, they're really not living a good life. The more dogs there are, the more likely you are to come in contact with one that's possibly sick, either with rabies or something else. By sterilizing, as in, you know, sort of removing their uterus or castrating them, you can make a huge difference to your communities. Male dogs especially, you know, tend to, if they're not castrated, they'll tend to go off every time there's a female nearby on heat, and they run the risk of being injured or getting sick or being hit by a car. There's also a condition called TVT, which is very common in community dogs, and you can see the little dog sitting on the car seat down here with that giant mass there. That is TVT. So that's a type of cancer which is spread when dogs are mating. So the more you can encourage people to have their dogs sterilized or neutered or spayed, the impact that you're going to see in the community is huge. The one thing I would like to point out, because we see a lot of it here, you can see the picture on the side here. This is a dog that someone has tried to castrate just using a rubber band. It is horrible. It is really, really, really horrible. It's painful. They get infected. But they tend to chew because they're so uncomfortable. They're trying to get rid of it. I can't stress how horrible this is and how it's really important to prevent people in the community from doing this. Advise them to have their dogs properly sterilized by a welfare organization and not try and do it themselves, because the amount of pain that this dog was in was incredible, and it's really, really nasty. So this next slide, I'm just going to go through quickly. It just shows you what effect just one dog can have on a community. So, okay, so if you start off with one female dog, and that female dog has, let's say, 6 puppies, okay? So let's say there was 3 boys and 3 girls. In 6 months' time, okay, well, so you're taking your total number of dogs up to 7 now, because you've got the mum plus her 6 puppies. In 6 months' time, when those dogs are now old enough to breed, those female dogs are going to each have another, say, 6 puppies each. So in a period of 6 months, you've gone from 1 dog to 25 dogs. Give it another 6 months, and those puppies are now old enough to have their own, and say each of them has 6 puppies, it means that in a period of 1 year, one female dog can end up creating 79. So just by sterilizing that one female dog, you can see what a huge difference you can make in your community. Okay, so this is something everyone always really enjoys, because you can kind of see how this works. I know there was a question that came in about the effect that taking the puppies away from the mother affected the mother dog. So I'm going to go a little bit into sort of timing and what we advise in terms of when puppies should be rehomed. So I would say the minimum age that a puppy should be removed from its mother is 8 weeks old. Okay, that's the absolute minimum. If possible, I like the puppies to stay with their mothers until they're 12 weeks. And this makes a huge difference to the puppies, because that time gives them it gives them the ability to learn from their mums. The puppies tend to do a lot better. They're nicer dogs because they're taught so much by their mums in this, and by their siblings as well in this period of time. So 8 to 12 weeks is generally the window that we advise in terms of when is the right time to take puppies away from their mothers. In terms of how that affects the mothers, weirdly enough, because by that stage the puppies are now eating on their own, the mums are generally sort of not producing as much milk anymore, it doesn't tend to affect the mothers that much. If you take them away when they're a lot younger, then it really, really does, because the mums are still in that mindset where they're taking care of the puppies, they're producing the milk. But as they get older, there seems to be this sort of switch where they kind of decide that the puppies are now old enough to look after themselves, and it's not such a big deal. But yeah, I would really, really advise that 8 to 12 weeks is the sort of time. But yeah, the idea of sterilization, this is what we focus on. This is our main goal in all of our community projects here, because the less unwanted dogs we have, then the less dogs we have to rescue, and the less dogs that are being unloved and unfed and getting sick. We had a big community project a couple of months ago, and we brought in a team of 12 vets, and we spent 3 days and we spayed 95 animals, and we vaccinated over 400. And that has made such a difference to the surrounding communities, and we're going to carry on doing that every year. So if that's the one thing that you can take away from this presentation, that the best thing you can do to help your community is try and partner with a welfare organization, get them in, encourage people why it's so important to have their dogs neutered and sterilized, have them vaccinated and have them dewormed regularly. And the effect that you will have on your community will be absolutely massive. So that's the end of it for me. Does anyone have any questions?
So my question is, in one of the slides you showed how the community people sometimes do the band sterilization for males, right? Has there been any attempts to do that for females?
No, because all of the females, because they're internal, it's not a problem. But we see it a lot with the male dogs in these communities, where people, a lot, because it's done on livestock, it's done on sheep. People think, oh, I'll just do it on the dog as well. The difference is that dogs have got teeth, and they, because they're in pain, they tend to chew and they tend to tear, and they do far more damage to themselves because they've got this chronic pain that is just there. And I mean, I don't like doing it in sheep either, but in dogs, they tend to do a lot more damage to themselves if it's done, and it's really important to discourage that.
Yeah, but how do they, I look at that horrible picture and I can't understand, do they die eventually? Because as you said, it causes lots of infections, and if people can't treat those infections, eventually they will die.
Yeah, they can die. We had one case a couple of months ago where they actually carried the dog into us. It was it was a skeleton. It had obviously not been able to walk or get to food or anything, and we did manage to save it, but it took about 3 months of treatment in the clinic to basically get the dog back up to strength.
Thank you so much. Morning.
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 Okay, my name is Leika. My question is about the response of the people in rural villages in Kenya through this cause. Because in my village a long time ago, people were not really taking much care of dogs. They were just roaming around the villages. No one would think of them, give them enough food. Sometimes cars would run into them and they would die, and they would leave the dog in the road for 5 days until it stinks and someone comes and remove it. But now they say a big change. People are starting to love dogs, protecting them, and they are also the biggest securities in their household. So how is the response from your side from, let me say, a few years back until where you are now?
That's amazing. Well, I'm really glad that you're seeing a change in your community. It's very similar here. I would say a lot of the problems we have are not necessarily because people don't like their dogs, but it's purely they just don't understand. They've been doing one thing for years and years and years, and they've never really thought about it. So what we try and do is sit down and talk to communities, and we ask them why they have dogs, why their dogs are important to them, what their dogs do for them. And by getting them to talk about it, they then start realizing how much the dogs do for them. So within the last 3 years, we've seen a big change in a lot of communities. I mean, we have a lot of rural communities around us, so we haven't necessarily got to as many as we can, but people are always willing. If we're setting up clinics, people will walk for miles to bring their dogs to us. And it's really interesting because obviously the dogs are important to them, but then you'll be watching them and the dog will walk up to them and they'll kind of smack it and push it away. Now, that's not because they hate their dog, it's just the way that they've always lived with their dogs. But things are changing, and as they realize how important and how much the dogs do for them, that's definitely changing. I mean, I had a dog a couple of months ago that had come to one of our community clinics, and we'd castrated it. The dog then sort of got out of its compound, and the one of the neighbors said it had been chasing the sheep. The owner of the dog said that wasn't the case, that the neighbor had been drunk. Anyway, he attacked the dog with a panga, and broke the dog's leg. But they love this dog so much that they managed to find a transport. I mean, they probably used more money on the transport than they had on their food for their family that month, and they brought the dog into us, and we took the leg off. But they, every time I drive through that community now, they come running up with the dog and they want to tell me how well he's doing and how everyone thinks it's really funny that he only has 3 legs. And so, I mean, there are, especially the children in the communities are changing a lot of their attitude towards it, and they really do love their dogs, and they really want to sort of do everything they can. So we are getting there, and as we're providing them with the resources which they didn't have access to before in terms of the vaccinations and everything, they're now seeing, what they can do for their dogs. And, we had a big problem with people chaining their dogs up. We had a lot of dogs that we were treating with wounds around their necks from where the chain had been too tight. And when you talk to them and you ask them why they're doing that, they say, the dog tends to run away and go missing, or, trying looking for food. And then when we've done the sterilization campaigns and we've spayed the females, we've castrated the females no longer want to go off and try and find a male. The males don't want to go off and find a female. Then you talk to them about feeding and how they can feed their dogs, and suddenly the dogs aren't trying to go off and find food somewhere else. And now the dogs are looking fat and happy and healthy, and they don't run away, they don't go missing, they don't get hit by cars. So it's a really special thing to watch as this changes.
Thank you so
I hope
much.
that sort of answered your question.
Yeah, because I've seen it also in our village where dogs will just keep giving birth, and people doesn't have enough money to provide food for them, and that's when they started hating those dogs, not liking them.
Yeah.
But yeah, since in our village we have the offices where you can go and they will help you with sterilizing your dog and giving you medicine that the dogs want. There's a big change there to second. I would also like to ask about you said it is zoonotic disease.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got a bit scared because
That's the one thing I wanted to avoid. I don't want, it sounds very, very scary. Okay.
yeah, wondering that if one struggles to see the symptoms, and then there are kids around who likes to play with dogs, and then the disease goes to a human being. Again, it's something
Yeah.
else. So that's what I was worried about. Like, what can we do to see the symptoms fast? Because sometimes people go to work, come back, they don't check their dogs, and then you find
Yeah.
that the symptom has been there for a week and they haven't
Yeah.
seen it. Now people are sick.
Yeah. So this is why vaccinations is the most important thing, because if you can get the dogs in your community vaccinated, then it's then they won't get rabies. So if everyone in the community vaccinates, then you've got less to worry about. But in terms of recognizing the behavior, the sort of simple rules that I give people to teach their children is, don't approach strange dogs. If you don't know the dog, don't walk up to it. Okay. If the dog seems to be acting oddly, so it's kind of walking funny, and it can't walk properly, it's not able to eat, all of that sort of stuff, just avoid it. Now, what I don't want is people panicking and going, oh my God, this dog could possibly have rabies, and then they start throwing stones, because that's not helping. That's really, really not helping. It's more about educating your community on vaccinating their dogs so that they don't need to worry about it, and just telling people, if they see a dog and they don't recognize it and it does seem to be behaving a little bit funny, report it to your state vet and just avoid it. Don't go anywhere near it, and just leave it be and tell your state vet. I mean, I know the state vets in South Africa are a lot better than what we have here. If you call a state vet here, you probably won't hear anything for about 2.5 months, and by that stage it's too late. So yeah, that's the most important thing. My point was, yes, it's scary, but I don't want anyone to panic. It's because all of those things that I've spoken about are very, very easy to avoid. Make sure the dogs are being fed proper food, make sure the dogs are vaccinated, make sure the dogs are dewormed. And so those three simple little things can make such a huge difference. So I covered all those topics because I wanted you to sort of understand how not looking after the dogs in the community can really negatively impact people, but how easy it is to change that. And so when the dogs are looked after, you're making not just the dogs healthy, but you're making the people healthy as well. Because we see a lot of that here where, we have very low income communities, and we go in to talk to them. And initially they're like, well, why are you here to look after animals? Why aren't you here to look after us? What's so important about our animals? And I say to them, well, yes, okay, I'm here because that's, my job. It's what I do to look after the animals. But the main reason why I do it is because I understand the way that sick animals can create sick people. So that, I would say, is the main thing to take back to your community. Get them to look after their animals, and they will look after themselves in doing so.
So is there any season where this disease is trending more in dogs? or it happens in?
Sorry, I struggled to hear that.
Is there any season where this disease is trending more? Like with young kids, season where we take them to the clinic so that they can vaccinate them for flu. So is there any this disease that is trending more in dogs, or is happening
that I'm not sure about, because where I live is on the equator, so we don't have any seasons. But yeah, I'm not sure about South Africa. I can't really remember. I mean, I don't think, rabies, worms probably. I know here when we get rain, we get a lot more puppies and kittens, so maybe that could possibly be one connection, that when you start getting the rain, then you'll probably end up having more younger animals. But yeah, I'm not familiar enough with your seasons to be able to answer that fully.
Okay, cool.
Kivara, if I may say, the tick-borne diseases, definitely on your side, when the summer rains come in, that will definitely have an effect.
Yeah.
Okay, so from what I have learned today, I think it will be best from my village and other villages that are nearby, if they can have a day where people that have dogs and those who doesn't have can gather in maybe a ground or a school where they see the presentation and see all those sickness that dogs can have. Because for myself, what I've seen today has opened my eyes, like, oh, I didn't know that there were diseases that dogs can have, and I can also be infected with those. I think if people can hear this kind of thing, they will be more interested, because nobody wants to be sick. They will be more interested in knowing the healthier of their dogs and making sure that they take care of them, because they will realize that taking care of their dogs is also making sure that they are also healthier. So thank you very much for answering my questions.
I just would like to clarify, I think it hasn't been clear for the last couple of days, and I hope that will help numbers. On raw red meat, chicken, and fish.
Oh,
yeah, because we heard a little bit of opposing opinions, and we just would like to know each three of them, which is appropriate to eat in raw, or all of them has to be cooked.
I would generally advise just to keep it simple, to have it cooked. Fish, you've got to be careful if you're feeding the larger ones, because obviously the fish bones are very dangerous. But just from me knowing sort of the community work, knowing that sort of the meat control factor and the health of the meat that they're getting is not always what, say, I'm finding in the supermarket. I always just advise cooking it because it's just safer. So yeah, red meat I'd cook, chicken I'd cook, and then fish. If it's the small ones that I showed you, then obviously bones are not a problem. But if you're feeding the sort of bigger fish, then again, definitely cook it and just make sure that the bones aren't fed. It'd be really interesting to know, obviously I don't want to confuse everyone by sort of giving different opinions, but maybe if you tell me a little bit about what was advised beforehand, I can maybe try and explain why different things have been advised.
Sorry, Valeria, I think the one thing, if I can just point out one thing, I think the question when Michelle answered it was related to, a dog that is perhaps very sick. So if the dog would eat raw meat, let the dog eat it, because you want it to eat.
Yeah. So that's the thing is that if you've got a sick dog and you're struggling to get it to eat, let it eat anything. Is the main thing. But obviously, try and make sure that where you're sourcing your meat from is good quality. But if it's just a general feeding, I would definitely say try and make sure it's cooked, just because it's safer for the dogs and it's safer for the people handling the dogs. We've seen with the sort of worldwide trend in raw diets, which everyone's sort of, it's a bit of a fad, and people kind of going, oh, but this is natural for the dogs to eat raw. That's great and everything, but if you can't guarantee where you're getting your meat from and the meat safety, there's a massive increase in salmonella cases in dogs and also in pet owners because of their contact with it. So it's it's a massive catch-22. You know, you have a lot of people who advocate the raw diet, saying, oh, my dog's healthier, my dog's shinier, my dog's this, but they don't fully understand, you know, the sort of risks of it either.
Okay, I see. Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. Any other questions? Unbelievable. Gives you a chance. Straightforward. Everything was straightforward.
No, I tried to, I think because I do these talks quite often to communities, I sort of understand what tends to be too complicated and go down a rabbit warren that takes hours and hours to explain, and what actually are the basics of what the take home is in terms of what you can do to help your communities.
Okay, great. Thank you so very much. Yeah, we really enjoyed. I made notes, I think 3 pages already. Yeah.
Valeria, then I'm going to just jump to the next thing. Do they have any questions or anything that they would share from the work environment that they perhaps want to ask questions about at this stage? Working with the dogs in the field, and you know, shall we go straight to that?
We just wanted to say that the members who actually work with the sniffer dog, they couldn't join us. There was like an issue. But what I think what we can do, just also for you to know what the members have learned, some of them were qualified as canine handlers before. So maybe ladies who have this qualification, you can just talk about your experience as a student and what kind of dogs you worked with in the past, and that certificate that you received, what kind of course it was, and like anything that you feel is important.
I want to ask on behalf of the K9 members that we do. So most of the time I hear them complaints about the leopard that is in the area where they're patrolling. So they sometimes tend to be scared when they are walking with the dog, and then the leopard, they just bump into the leopard, because they can see the reaction in the dog and the leopard. Most of the time the dog will be running back to them. So they fear that when the dog is running back to them and the leopard wants to eat the dog, the leopard will attack them. So in what should they do in this kind of situation for them to feel safe and their dog to feel safe in whenever they come across this leopard?
Oh, that's yeah, that's a tricky question. not really sort of vet related, but I'll try and answer it. Yeah, I mean, leopards are always very, very tricky, and you know, I'm lucky in that my dog is very good around leopards, and so she tends to let me know quite quickly if she knows that there's a cat in the area, and then I will just remove myself from that situation. I think it is a tricky one. I know some people sort of advise releasing the dog, letting them off, so that the dog is then further away from the handler to then split the risk between yourself and the dog. But then, you know, you're putting the dog and yourself at risk still, but it's just a slightly sort of smaller chance. I think the main thing is just sort of working with the dogs so that you have a trusting relationship, and if you notice that the dogs are behaving oddly or they're nervous of something, is to sort of recognize that they probably will pick that up much, you know, sooner than you will, and to try and remove yourself from that situation as calmly and quickly as possible, until you're able to actually have a sort of a proper look at from a safer place, like a vehicle.
So in Johan, in that kind of situation, is the dog supposed to run back to me, or the dog is supposed to, if ever the leopard attack us, is the dog supposed to run to me, or is the dog supposed to fight with the leopard?
I think that was directed at you.
I don't want to answer. I've had a practical case where I had a massive baboon in my house, and at that stage I owned a Rhodesian Ridgeback, and the dog attacked the baboon, and successfully attacked the baboon. Removed the baboon from the room. But that's a massive risk, you know. If your dog is going to attack a wild animal, there's going to be a fight, and then your dog is going to get injured. I would go with what Kivara said and try and, if at all possible, you know, retreat from the situation. But I am not an expert. I mean, I'm just telling you from the personal experiences that I've had with dogs in the wild. I'm not an expert at all on that. But I think what you need to do is between yourselves, you know, decide what you're going to do beforehand when these situations come up. Because if you try to decide it in the situation, it's very difficult.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I would say is learning how your dogs react to certain situations will give you a lot more information, because I mean, I know whenever I'm within, you know, a kilometer of a lion or a leopard, because my dog starts shaking, you know, like a leaf. So then I'm like, okay, right, there's something here. So if you can then start picking up behavioral patterns with your dog will be an early warning sign so that you can remove yourself from that situation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you for your time. That was very interesting.
Right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.